For today's lesson, we're going to wrap up the American Revolution. We're going to focus on two things, some of the different groups in the colonies that helped the war effort, as well as the last and final battle and what peace means for the colonies. One of the trends we'll find in our class is that anytime we talk about a war, we'll always look at how the war impacts people at home. So on this particular slide, we're looking at women and American Indians. You've already looked a little bit at the Daughters of Liberty, but we know it was a way for colonial women to protest the British taxation policies, such as sewing their own clothes, making their own fabric. A lot of times they would follow the camp of soldiers around and cook and clean for them. They could even act as spies. The British men didn't think anything about women wandering into their camps. In fact, they appreciated their arrival, and so a lot of times they were looser lips and they were saying things, not thinking that the women could be spying on them. And there are even some really cool examples of women disguising themselves as men to be able to fight. Now, when we look at our American Indians, this is a little bit different. Many of the tribes, especially on the frontier, were more likely to side with the British, even though they necessarily didn't like the British compared to the French. It was really the colonists were the ones that were taking their land and scalping them and burning their villages. And so on the frontier, you'll see that those tribes are more likely to side with the British, whereas some of the tribes closer to the coast were a little bit more divided. Okay. Generally speaking, when the war is over, there will be continual problems with the tribes on the frontier, and this will be something that Washington will have to focus on. One of the things that's always so interesting to contemplate is the role of slaves and free blacks during the war. In many cases, if you were a slave in this time period living in the southern colonies, you were ruled by pretty strict slave codes. So why would you want to fight for the colonists? Then at the same time, the British had been participating in the slave trade. So it's a really interesting dilemma here. In Virginia, the royal governor issues a proclamation and basically promises any slave in colonial Virginia that fights for the British would be able to gain their independence. So we will see some that will go and fight for the British, and that was known as Lord Dunmore's proclamation. But then there's also thousands of slaves that fight for the Patriots and really believe in the cause, and they do this hoping that maybe if the colonists win, it will lead to better conditions and maybe even freedom. When the war is over, we will eventually see that some of the northern states start to abolish slavery. There will be some individual slaves that gain their freedom, but a lot of the slaves that had fought for the British actually end up being deported to the Caribbean. So there's not any really major significant positive change. There are some little exceptions. After the Battle of Saratoga, the Americans get a huge boost into their war effort. Not only has the tide turned, but the morale is changing, and they've gained a lot from the French. Money, supplies, the Navy, and it's at the Battle of Yorktown where we really see the full impact of that French assistance. This will be the end of the American Revolution. I always tell students, think about why Yorktown, why is the end of the alphabet? This is the end of the war. This will take place in colonial Virginia. As you can see on the slide, there's a little bit of background information. The new American government, which we're going to start talking about in a couple of days, was not in a great spot financially. There were a lot of concerns about how they're going to continue to pay for a war. And the British hoped that they could try to divide the southern colonies. Remember, the South is where you're going to see the largest number of loyalists, so they're hoping to capitalize on that. But ultimately, what's going to happen is the guy on the right is a general by the name of Lord Cornwallis, and he's going to end up falling back in the Chesapeake and wait for supplies. And at that moment is where the French are really going to swoop in with their navy, and this is a game changer. This helps not only the Americans win this battle, but ultimately win the war. Now that the war is over, the time has come to work on a peace treaty. So there will be three famous Americans that go to Paris to work out the details. That will be Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. They want full independence. They want land. The British are hoping to still somehow hold on to them. And even France is a little nervous, like, oh no, kind of like, what have we just created? And a little cautious about giving the Americans what they want. So what does this peace treaty look like? It's going to take place in Paris in 1783. The British will formally recognize our independence. We will gain the land from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Mississippi River. Please note that Florida is still part of Spain. We won't have Florida until the 1820s. We are going to try to repay the debts that we owe the British, and any land that the colonists took from the Loyalists, they're supposed to turn back over. Okay, so the key thing here is independence and the land that we gain. When we think about the end of the American Revolution, we also have to think about the short-term and long-term impact for the colonists and the people around them. Obviously, the most important is independence, and this is huge. But our victory will inspire others in the coming years in Haiti and France. We're going to create this new experiment, this democracy that hasn't really been done too much in modern terms. And, there's going to be some trials and tribulations along the way as we figure out how to make this work. And I think we still are kind of figuring it out today. And then we think about this phrase that all men are created equal. Who was created equal? What did that mean in the 1770s and 1780s? And we know that a lot of groups are left out of it, but we're going to see this year how many people will fight for equality. And their key argument will be this line from the Declaration. Unfortunately for the colonies, as they transition to an independent nation, they're going to be in significant debt and going to really struggle to pay off that debt. They're going to lose their guaranteed trading partner, and what impact will that have on the economy?